Uh, First of all, you're very welcome. This is the beginning of a 4-week program of Stories Through Time. And this program is funded by the Department of Communities as part of the Warm, Well and Connected program, facilitated by the Healthy Living Centre Alliance, and delivered to you this evening by Teresa and the Rural Health Partnership Living Centre in Cullyhanna. So I suppose for me, Stories Through Time, my background or my life has been history. I love history, and I love history in the history that's outside of the history books, because history books, by their very nature, uh, give the big pieces of history, which is exactly how it's always going to be. But what interests me particularly is social history, and the whole remit of social history, and how we join our history together in bits and pieces, and who delivers it. There's a lovely saying that went, the victors write the history, which was very true in all countries. And Frank Hart, who was a lovely song collector, came after that and said, the victors write the history and the losers write the songs, which is why Ireland had so many sad songs. And I suppose I will come after that and say, and the women disappeared, because the women were not part of either the writing of the history or appearing in the history. And that led to a lack of social history. If those women had to be part of the telling of those stories, then we would have had a much more comprehensive way of telling our history. So we have, in the last couple of years, looked at different ways of telling history, rather than an academic professor, usually standing in a room and delivering a lecture. We have looked at how you put history together in a more cohesive way that joins up the dots. So part of that is what we're going to look at tonight, is how we tell the stories, who tells the stories, what bits got lost, and where do we look for them if we can't find them. So I'm going to show you a short video first of all, and then I'm going to come back and talk to you about the full story behind it. This is the story of the Hannah, a famine ship which left Warren Point on the 3rd of July 1849, bound for Quebec. The famine was the greatest tragedy in our Irish history. In the years 1845 to 1849, 1 million people died and another 1 million people left the country. South Armagh and our parish of Forkhill was in a state approaching starvation. The relief work had stopped, and Reverend James Campbell, chairman of the Forkhill Relief Committee, said that of the population of 8,000, only 120 people were employed in public work. The Newry Workhouse, which served most of the Forkhill parish, was closed for admission to paupers. It was against this hardship that the tenants of the Forkhill parish booked their passage on the Hannah. The Hannah was a coal boat which had been converted to carry passengers and had 176 passengers booked for the journey. As the Hannah approached the Gulf of St. Lawrence on the 28th of April, it came into collision with the ice at 4 o'clock in the morning and foundered within an hour. The captain, Captain Shaw, and his crew abandoned the ship in a lifeboat and left the passengers on the ice. Captain Marshall and his crew of the ship Nicaragua came upon the sinking ship and the passengers who had climbed upon the ice and others still in the water. He rescued 121 passengers and 49 lost their lives, many of them children. After the awful ordeal, which left many of them maimed from frostbite and traumatized by losing family members, some of the survivors of the Hannah made their way to the Westport area of Ontario, where they settled in North Crosby Township. Paddy Murphy, the man who brought the story home from Canada, said, "We call this place Little South Armagh." Part of the story had been told as a family history in the Quinn family of Carricknagavna. They talked of an ancestor named Grant from Tullymacreeve who was to emigrate on the famine ship. She was afraid and began to cry at the docks and wanted to stay. She was allowed to come back home with her aunt. And the story came back to them that the boat had hit ice and that the other 4 children, her brothers and sisters, had died. When Paddy Murphy came to visit his cousin John Arthur Donnelly, he had information and records that proved the story carried by the Quinns. And so we told the remarkable story of the Hannah and of Westport, who welcomed our South Armagh people when they had a tragedy. So when you come to the quaint little town of Westport, as hurrying on you roam, you would do well to slacken down, for you'll find no better. This is the story of the Foster. The famine was the great. So that's the story of the Hannah. Now that's a book that eventually got turned into a book, but that's a 4-minute clip of recording a story in a way that is accessible to people, gives you a very good background, and more than that, it celebrates what is the most important part of local history, and that is the oral tradition. Because that part of the story had been in the Quinn family. They had told through their own lineage, through the Quinns, they had said that there had been a tragedy. That there was a tragedy in South Armagh that was like the Titanic, that there had been a boat lost. But there was no verification of that story. So in 2003, myself and Kevin Murphy were working on a book around the townlands. We had just put in Townland Stones here in Mullaban, and we were working on a book that would go along with it. When Paddy Murphy arrived and knocked the door of Mullaban Hall and said, "Can I tell you a story?" And Paddy had come from outside Westport in Ontario in his homeland that they called Little South Armagh. And he had the ship's manifest of the boat with the names of the people, the passengers on the boat, most of them coming from the townlands here around Mullaban and Forkhill. And because we had an 1821 census, the first census of Ireland was taken up in 1821 and then taken up every 10 years. You're due a census now to be taken up in 2021. But the census was taken up every 10 years. The census material was stored in the Four Courts in Dublin. The Four Courts were burned in the Civil War of 1922. So the census material for Ireland is almost completely lost until you come to 1901. But a full census for 17 townlands for this area of Mullaban and Forkhill was found in the Jackson Trust papers. So we had the 1821 census, which proved that those people were alive and their ages and that they were living in this area. Paddy Murphy had the ship's manifest and the records from Canada, and the two pieces joined together and closed the dots and proved that the story was right. So we had no place within the Townland book to put this story. This was a completely different story. 3 years later, we published a small book with the complete story in it. And part of it then, as with all of the modern works, part of it went onto the internet. So the story had come from Canada about the rescue of the people on the ice, rescued by the ship, the Nicaragua. And that piece of the story had gone on to the internet. And we were contacted then a couple of years after the book was published by a Methodist minister from North Wales His name was Alan Evans, and his great, great, great grandfather was the captain of the Nicaragua boat, which saved the people from South Armagh. And he had in his possession the cup that was awarded to his ancestor when he got as far as Quebec for his bravery in saving them. And inside a couple of years, Alan Evans came from Wales to South Armagh and met some of the families that were part of the families that were involved in the ship, the Hannah, and the boat, the Hannah. The story was taken up by BBC and by Canadian television, and there was a drama documentary put out with some of the families again involved, the families from here and Paddy Murphy's family from Canada. So one chance piece of an oral history that had been carried down through one family. There was no trace of this story in any other families, but in that one family, that trace of an oral tradition that was handed down was enough to join up the dots when somebody else came with more information. One of the earliest things I remember my father say to us at home as children was, "You're a blessed and lucky people. Look where you were born." Now, mostly at that time, he was talking to us in terms of the environmental and the archaeology and the history. But our grace, and we have many assets. South Armagh is a wonderful, wonderful area with many good assets. But I think our greatest asset is our oral tradition and our people that carried those stories on and left a legacy there to be able to tell. So that's one of them. And that's looking at how you tell that story in a modern format that isn't a lecture that you could put out on social media and is available for everybody to watch and to see. And to look at how the South Armagh area was part of that bigger history of Ireland and the famine. And to look at what that famine did in terms of not only in trauma, but to take two of our townlands, if we take Cashel and Anduff as two of them that we had taken in a survey, so that from the year of 1851 until the year of 1891, the population of both of those townlands, due to famine, fever, and emigration, had gone down by 55%, which is a big, big. We tended to think that unless people died as part of the famine, there was no legacy. The biggest legacy of the famine was emigration, was the movement of people who had to leave. I think until my mother died, and I think again it's part of that trauma of the famine. No matter how luxurious a nursing home was, she equated the nursing home to the workhouse. It had never moved on in her mind, the fact that people weren't dying with their own people in their own homes. So those are all the stories, I suppose, that are hidden stories that we haven't fully examined. But it's a new way and it's a unique way, I think, of telling history. The next video I want to show you is a remarkable piece of work again, and some of the women that are watching it in either in this video or in others that were compiled were part of this story and this journey.
Maud Gaughan, on visiting Slieve Gullion, wrote that the mountain sang to her, and well it might have, for this is a landscape steeped in song, where poetry and place, bards and burial grounds, lakes and lore, slave and the song are so interwoven it can be impossible to distinguish or separate them. It was here beneath Gullion slopes in South Armagh that the last great poets of the Gaelic order took refuge under the protection of Ireland's most prolific dynasty of Gaels, Clan O'Neill, a clan that built their castle at Glasdrummun, watching over Dunreavy Woods and resisting foreign invasion from the south, just as the Anglo-Norman queen Rhodesia built her own fortress beyond at Roche. These hills were home to scholars and to saints, Gaelic royalty and rapparees, and the memory of each one lives on through the rich body of songs that were passed down from the poets to the people in the unique Gaelic dialect of the region. Later, they were recorded and preserved by the folk collectors of the last century, who travelled South Armagh, gathering and cataloguing these precious words and melodies. For the longest time, this mysterious haven of music has been an untapped well for lovers of song. But now, here in this present day, with the dedication of local scholars and the emergence of a vibrant new generation of South Armagh Gaelic speakers and singers, we are on a journey of reclamation and discovery. We are waking up once more to that precious heritage that has been left for us all. We invite you to come with us on this journey. Éilíonn.
Abidi bo went to do dag macreedoo, dash gave the cook at the hurling just done. Now Rosa Clark didn't crim rush of fry errands, and young Clement cheapity bob. I cast my eye on this charming fair maiden, his fee, but that genuine on the more free. For a way to the store, if you go with anyone, leave your mommy and come with me. Little bitty, my darling, I'll dress you in scarlet, with the neatest of broadcloth that across the mean. I'd rather me, darling, than 10,000 sterling, if I had you in my arms from morning till noon. I cast my eye on this charming fair maiden, this fee, but that gentleman on the more green. For a wish is a store, if you go with anyone, leave your mommy and come with me. Abo halio katami bila posu apos and go joey in our word dear. Turn ye hit the slaughter to my young war, tajan and la rule go jelly. I cast my eye on this charming fair maiden, this fee, but that genuine on the more free. For a wish is a store, if you go with anyone, leave your mommy and come with me. Very young man and many coming to me and from me, they'll all say they'll have me, but it's all in vain. Sure, it's well known to many, I'm a deep love with Jemmy, and I never will marry till see him again. I cast my eye on this charming fair maiden, his fee, but that genuine on the more green. For a wish is a store, if you go with anyone, leave your mommy and come with me. Da made you more da dror is day or more better jingle and the kill. Da glinnet more story and made you roll up to go on a bill, got this bill one. I cast my eye on this charming fair maiden, this fee, but that genuine on the more free. For a wish is a store, if you go with anyone, leave your mommy and come with me. Was once in my youth when I took a ramble, no Gulan farm and no trouble of done. I asked her kindly if she would marry me, but no army sailing on. I cast my eye on this charming fair maiden, this fee, but that genuine on the more free. For a wish is a store, if you go with anyone, leave your mommy and come with me. I go army is sailing on.
Now, I think I saw Colleen Savage maybe booking in earlier on, and Colleen and Blahi McCann, Maria Carraher, and Aisling Gribben were involved in the compiling of that video footage that went on the stories that went with that. Marita's there. Marita was involved in the one that was put together around farming. I think I saw Mary there who was involved in the one that was around lace. These were a set of videos that were worked with the Nerve Centre in Derry, and it was around changing the narrative and telling the story with women's voices. They were a magnificent piece of work, and I didn't pick that one in saying that it was any better than any of the rest of them. I picked that one because I have, I suppose, for the last 40 years, worked a campaign of bringing people to South Armagh to talk about South Armagh, to spread the story of South Armagh. And I look at a video that was produced by 4 women in this area, and I think to myself, why have they not got jobs with the tourist board in Northern Ireland? Because in a couple of short weeks, they put together something that the tourist board have not been able to do throughout their existence in South Armagh. But the video celebrates the poetry and the song of the area. But it has such a visual story to tell, because throughout that footage, you went from 6,000 years ago. You saw the passage grave at the top of Slievegullien. You recognized that 6,000 years ago, people had the capacity to build a passage grave, and they were so in tune with the heavens and the movement of the earth that they knew that on 3 days of the winter solstice at the setting sun, that the sun would light up the passage grave inside, exactly as it does on the rising sun of the winter solstice at Newgrange. But instead of it being a passage grave that is extremely expensive to visit, as Newgrange is, and is probably priced outside of the range of a lot of its own people, to go to Slievegullien, you just need to climb the mountain. It's exactly in its natural state, which is the best way to view a monument. You saw Anamar Court Cairn, the finest court cairn in Ireland, almost completely intact. There's not one to match it anywhere in the area. So you not only gathered the history of the songs as you went along and the story of the songs, but you visually carried a story in a different way. They took you to Cregan, to the home of Clanny Neil, the O'Neills. The O'Neills had come from Tyrone into South Armagh in 1480. They had built their church at Cregan and their castle at Glasdrummond, and built their castle at Glasdrummond because it directly faced the one that you saw calling at Castle Roach, the last of the greatest and most strategically placed of the Anglo-Irish castles in Ireland. The Anglo-Normans came to Ireland in 1169 up the east coast of Ireland to what was known as the Pale, and the last of their outposts was Castle Roach, built by Rhodesia de Verdon in the 1200s. Her grandfather, one of the first knights into Ireland, Bertram de Verdon, founded the town of Dundalk, Castletown, the Mott and Bailey outside Dundalk, founded by Bertram de Verdon. And Rhodesia built Castle Roach on a triangular rock, a triangular shaped castle, a magnificent 3-story high castle. And if you're up at the top of it even now, you have a view of 9 counties right around you. But this lovely story that goes with it is that she had looked for an architect to build this wonderful castle. And when she didn't attract an architect, she offered her hand in marriage to the architect who would come and design and build her castle. And that attracted a few takers. So castle was built, marriage had taken place, but before the consummation of that marriage that night, she had brought him upstairs and she turfed him out the upstairs window in an area at the side of the building that will still be known locally as the murder window. So you took on Rhodesia at your peril. But all of that was captured in a small 4-minute video. First of all, the absolute beauty of this area. Secondly, the amount of archaeology and history that's in it. And the carrying on again, the oral tradition of where the people held the stories until it was time to reclaim them, as Blahin and Colin did when they sang the song in their first language, in the Irish language. So this is the uniqueness that is South Armagh. And this is the new way of telling the stories. Women in particular, and especially South Armagh women that I grew up with, would have said they didn't have a story to tell. They thought that the important stories were in somebody else's area or in somebody else's life, that it wasn't in their lives. But actually the person who carried the stories best were the women, that because they were handed down. But I just want to read you, anyone that's of my age will know about the tea chest. The tea chest was part of most houses. Mickey's mother used to talk about, my husband's mother, my mother-in-law, used to talk about the tea chest and each of them as they were fit to be, to walk about and get on our way. They were put in the tea chest. Okay. But the tea chest was in the kitchen one day and the priest arrived. And of course, the tea was made when the priest arrived, because that was a very important person to be coming into the house. And the child who was in the tea chest at that time was very shy. And once the stranger came in and he heard the stranger's voice, he dropped down into the tea chest. Now, the tea chest was used for different varieties of people or animals living in it. So the tea chest began to move slightly when the child got fed up waiting for the stranger to go, and he started to shuffle his bum and move it about a bit. And the priest wasn't sure exactly what was in the tea chest until eventually she said 2 big fat hands came up across the top of it and a curly head appeared. And the priest said, well, at least it's a child. But this is the tea chest. This was written by Mary McCartan, who's from the Forkhill area and a wonderful storyteller. From exotic faraway places on ships across the sea to a village shop in the country, a chest packed full of tea. Mary had reached her limit, the children all quite small. I can't get out to work on the farm, for I don't know where they'll crawl. I can't go out in the cornfield with a child strapped to my breast. I'm begging you, when it's finished, will you give me that tea chest? They sent the chest to Mary with a 1/2 ton of coal. There was measuring and figuring to see what it would hold. There were walking ones and creeping ones that sat on the knee. They came to the conclusion they'd fit in 2 or 3. They'd lined it with an old floor cloth and finally did decide, though it wasn't really all that big, that 3 would fit inside. They popped them in, they seemed to fit, and there wasn't any doubt, unless the chest fell over, there's no way they'd get out. When Mary was out weeding or helping till the ground, the tea chest was beside her and the children safe and sound. In later years, at pigging time, with suckers round her feet, she put them in the tea chest, take them in and break their teeth. With the clock and hen, it was there again, the clutch of eggs were set, with a horseshoe on the bottom, in case thunder had effect, and the lid put on with a stone on top to keep her on the nest. She was safe from harm, and the eggs were warm, and let nature do the rest. A playing pen, a box for pigs, a cosy brooding nest, from India to Ireland, that useful out to your chest. Now, the tea chest was part of all of the women's stories, but again, they didn't think the story was worth telling until Mary wrote it from her knowing of her own. So I'd just like to share with you then a personal story. Now, this is my lineage of women. This is 6 generations of the women of my house. So if we're starting down at the right-hand corner facing you, these are my 2 granddaughters, Leah and Clena. Directly above them and to the left at the bottom, to the middle at the bottom, are my 5 daughters, Niamh, Aibín, Aoife, Keelan and Shifra. I'm in the centre, and to the left-hand side at the bottom are myself and my 2 sisters, Anne and Genevieve. Directly above us is my mother, and to the side of my mother with the bicycle is my grandmother, and to the side of that is my grandmother as a baby, held by her mother, my great-grandmother. So in that picture, there are 6 generations of women. The 6 generations running from my great-grandmother down are Mary Martin from the townland of Cashel. My grandmother was Aggie McKeever from Umracam. My mother was Annie McKeever. My grandmother, rather, was Agnes Kelly from the townland of Umracam. My mother was Annie McKeever from the townland of Dorsey. I'm Una Murphy from the townland of Tullydonnell. My 5 daughters are from the townland of Mafoner, and my 2 granddaughters, one from Mafoner and one from Clochraven, down beside Beshbrook. 2 strong women, may we know them, may we be them, may we raise them. This 6th generation of women were born within a 7-mile radius from the 1800s to the present day. My mother was a farmer, was the farmer in our house because my father worked out of the farm. So she did all of the farming work. She reared hens, she fattened pigs, she reared turkeys for the Christmas market, and she was the financial mover of money that she never called her own. I was over home one night, not that long before Mommy died, and we were talking, and I was her eldest daughter. So the hens, I was part of the hens journey. Or if you were from Tullydonnell when I was growing up, there weren't hens, there were hens. So I was part of the hens journey. The hens were kept on deep litter. So probably if you're much younger than me, that's something that you've never come across. But the hens were on deep litter. There were roosts, wooden roosts across, and the hens sat very nicely and correctly all up on their roosts, very quietly, until you opened the door of the hen house. And the minute you opened the door of the hen house, every hen in the place flew up in the air, and feathers and dust and dirt fell out of them, and they squawked and they squawked and they squawked. And I said to her that night when we were talking, geez, mommy, I hated hens. And she looked at me and she said, well, you might have done una, but they reared you. And she was right, because every Wednesday, my mother had 6 dozen crates of eggs for Jim Toner from Newton Hamilton, who came with the travelling shop. And she gave the eggs and he gave her the groceries that corresponded to the price of the eggs. And that was the day-to-day living and the financial input that she was making to the rearing of 6 of us. And when my father would have said, looking around him, you're a blessed and lucky people, look where you were reared, she'd say, no, and that'll feed you on a Friday evening. So the women of this community were the strongest women, I think, that could have been in any community. In the way of life that they lived, in the hardship that they went through, and how they ensured that the generation that came after them had a better quality of life. So I think it's important that we recognize those stories. It's important that our young people, my grandchildren, I'm now the matriarch of this family, I suppose, in that the 3 people in the pictures above have gone. It's important that my grandchildren are told what life was like for the women of that time, of what they had done and the improvements they had made in life, and that their stories are central to how we go forward and how we tell them. So just as Colleen and Blahin and Marita and Mary, just as they created a new forum and a new way of telling those stories, it's important that all of those stories are gathered. And I often think now, as an older woman, which I am, that they live their life. If there was one motto that they lived their life by, I think it was the words of Anna Parnell. Anna Parnell was the founder of the Women's Land League, one of the most impressive organisations ever founded in Ireland, and almost completely written out of history. Anna Parnell said that the greatest of all independence is the independence of the mind. And that's the sort of women I grew up with, women who were independent thinkers, who made their own judgments and worked on their own judgment. I just want to show you this, the cup. The cup, this cup is a very important cup in the history of my family, of the women of my family. This cup has been touched by 5 generations of those women that I have shown you. It was bought for my mother by her mother for her wedding on the 11th of January 1948. My mommy told me that it was bought by her mother at the last standing at Crossfair before the Christmas of 1947. So just 2 years after the war, still at a time when you had rationing. So she bought this set of china and she gave it to my mother as her wedding present. All my lifetime, it was behind a glass door. We never had tea in this cup. We were afraid to blink at the cup in case anything happened to it. The only time it ever came out of the cabinet and made it onto the table, my mother had 4 aunts who emigrated to America, and only one of those women ever was heard tell of again. She has elderly cousins living in Bessbrook, and I visit them. I'm 66 years of age, and when I knock the door, you'll see Deirdre looking out the window, and she says to Violet, "It's Annie's wee daughter." So I'm still Annie's wee daughter somewhere in the world. And I said to them one evening when we were talking about it, I said, some of them would have done well of these 4 women in America. And Violet looked at me and she said, they left Ireland skivvies, there were skivvies in America, and they died skivvies. And some of those stories are starting to be retold about the hardship that happened in America. That every story wasn't a good luck story. But one of those women who'd emigrated, the family made contact, and 2 first cousins of my mother's arrived to Tullydonald in the 1960s, and the tea set was taken out of the china cabinet and it went onto the table, and they had tea inside that cup. And we all drew breath, and I think we held our breath until the cups were emptied and washed and put back into the cabinet. So, as the elder daughter of the house, I claimed the tea set. My mother was her mother's eldest daughter, and as the eldest daughter, I claimed the tea set, and it's now in my possession. So every house has something that is important, and for me, it's the cup. So we're almost coming to the end of our hour, and we started off saying that this had been funded by the Department of Communities as a program of Warm, Well and Connected project, of the importance of us being able to connect with each other, of the importance through this time of us taking care of each other. And this poem is by John O'Donoghue. John O'Donoghue was a priest and a poet, and very much a follower of Celtic spirituality. Now, the poem is called Time to Be Slow. And it's remarkable because the poem is relevant now in the time of the pandemic. But it's something that the older people done. If you think of how the older people live their life to the seasons and the turning of the seasons, so that all of the outside work took place in the summer and the spring, summer and autumn of the year. And when it came to winter time, when the weather was bad and it was difficult to do anything outside, people moved into the houses. They cailed with each other, they told stories, they supported each other, and they knew it was the time to slow down and wait for the turning of the season until you came again to spring. They knew instinctively that was the thing to do. In a modern world, we now have scientific proof of the benefit of sunlight, of the benefit of people talking to each other, of the benefit of not being isolated. So all of the things that the old people knew by their way of living life are now scientifically proved. But this poem is called Time to Be Slow. So just think of it in terms of coming through the pandemic, as I hope we are, almost on the turn and starting to move back. This is the time to be slow. Lay low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best as you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself and your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on fresh pastures of promise, when the air will be kind and blushed with beginning. Time to Be Slow by John O'Donoghue. and everybody to look after themselves. So we're on the close of the hour. If there's anybody listening that wants to come in with any comment or to add to a story, you're more than welcome before we close.
Just to say I enjoyed it very much, Una. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much
Mary.
for doing that.
And
doing
Mary,
this.
Mary's one of the women who was involved in the video around the lace making. And
Yes.
we're going to feature the lace making next week as
Oh,
part of
brilliant.
International Women's Day. The next story on the 9th of this night week will be around International Women's Day and around again the women. So that must be Mary's question now. What was the last graveyard on the video?
Yeah.
The last graveyard on the video, Mary, was Orney Graveyard. Orney Graveyard is just outside the village of Forkhill, but in the County Louth. It's in the south of Ireland. Orney means prayer. Now, in several parts of Ireland, Orney is used as a townland name, but in this area, Orney just is that graveyard. It's a very old graveyard. It's from the time of Patrick. It's a patrician church, so it's one of the oldest. It and Killeavy graveyards, which is dated back to Menina, are two of the oldest graveyards in the South Armagh area. Peadar O'Dornan. O'Dornan was one of the last of the Gaelic poets of the Southeast Ulster tradition. Peadar O'Dornan is buried in Orney Graveyard. So some of his love poetry and his love songs are some of the songs that are now being sung. Ernach Cian McCancha, the Green Hill of Cian, son of Cancha, is one of his songs. Another of them is Manana Hearn, Women of Ireland. Now I was doing a piece of work in Forkhill and had written up some of the stories about O'Dornan, and I was talking about it here that night with some of my girls and played the music. Peadar O'Dornan died in 1769. So in 1969, there was a concert in the National Theatre in Dublin, and the music was played by Sean O'Reada, who was the founder of Cultus Cultori Erin. And the song Manana Hearn was set to music for that and was sung that night for the first time by Sean O'Shea, very, very beautiful traditional Irish singer. So I was explaining this that night in the house, and I played the music of Manana Hearn, and immediately they listed off 4 or 5 films that the soundtracks had been part of, played by the chieftains. So they had new information that I didn't know about, and I was giving them the old information around Peadar O'Dornan. So that's where Orney Graveyard is. There's a lovely old story I collected from one of the Miss McAnulty's, just on the edge of the Mass Pad leaves Forkhill village, and it runs right along the river over to Orney Graveyard, crosses the border as part of that and into County Louth. But on bad days, that river will flood and the Mass Pad would be covered in water. And she told me that her grandfather used to tell a story. It would have buried from a good part of South Armagh at one time, but he told her the story of a funeral coming from Balik on a bad winter's day, and by the time they'd made it from Balik up to Forkhill, it was edging dark, and it had been a very, very wet week, and they knew that the Mass Pad was likely to be flooded. So he told her that they put the coffin under the ditch, and they went back home to Balik, and they just came back the next morning and took it the rest of the bit over. And he said to her, and Divil the one touched it. So Orney is a very, very ancient graveyard, and well worth anybody coming to see it. But there is nothing in South Armagh that's not worth seeing. Those stories, that's what the stories are, what puts the flesh on pieces of history. The place to look for local history is in your ballads and your songs, and the things that were written at that time by the people. And because they were written by the local people, they're written in the speech pattern and the way that people talked. They're not written in the standard English form. They haven't been corrected or glossed up. They're said as they were said. And they're wonderful stories. I went over home one day with my eldest child, who's now 44. And he was a girling child, crying child, very colicky. And we'd been there for a while, and eventually my mother said to me, that fella could do with a spoon of punch and it would lift that wind, which was a very common practice in all houses when I was growing up. And I got all flustered, and this new child and me, a new mother, and all of the advice that had been given by health visitors and nurses. And I said, oh, Mommy, no, you can't do that, Mommy, because that's very dangerous, and you're not allowed to do that, and that would choke him. But needless to say, she went out to boil the kettle anyway. Having reared 6 of us, she thought she knew a bit more about it than me. And I was there in a fluster, and I said to my granda, who was sitting in the corner, she can't give him punch, granda, she'll choke him. Now, my granda was fond of a drop of whiskey and fond of it in a wee drop of punch. And he looked at me and he said, it'll be all right, daughter, he says, if it's anything like the stuff I get, it'll not do him one button of harm. He says, your mother's terrible fond of water. So she gave the child, now, when my granda be looking punch at night, he'd be looking out to put no water in it and just buy the whiskey. And she went the other way, and it was mostly water and very little whiskey. So he reckoned it wouldn't do my child one button of harm. Okay, so if nobody else has anything to say, we'll leave it for tonight. Next Tuesday night is a celebration of International Women's Day and a celebration of South Armagh women, and that in no way precludes men from coming. I hope to see you all again next week, and thank you very much for your company. Good night.